Resilience is a popular word these days, used in many fields, from the stock market to international organizations planning disaster response, from questions for candidates at political debates, to education reform, to trauma therapy. Resilience is the goal. What is resilience? Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines resilience as an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. It goes on to say, in physics, resilience is the ability of an elastic material, such as rubber or animal tissue, to absorb energy, such as from a blow, and release that energy as it springs back to shape. The recovery that occurs in this phenomenon can be viewed as analogous to a person's ability to bounce back after a jarring setback. The word resilience derives from the Latin verb resiliere, meaning to jump back. The base of resiliere is salire, a verb meaning to leap. This definition may explain our attraction to resilience. It connotes action. Human beings have the power to respond to adversity, not just to be victims of it. We can learn to be resilient. Grit, some people say, is a close cousin of resilience. It is one of the tools that can be used to build resilience. The dictionary says grit means sand or gravel, for one, but also a firmness of mind or spirit, unyielding courage in the face of hardship or danger. Synonyms of grit are backbone, fortitude, guts, spunk. Antonym is spinelessness. Grit makes me think of gritting your teeth and powering through adversity. And sometimes we have to do that. But some say grit has more nuance and can be leveraged to build resilience. Angela Lee Duckworth, a psychologist and recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, wrote a book called Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. She defines grit as the tendency to pursue long-term goals with passion and persistence. I took her grit scale test. You know, sermon research. It's just 10 questions in which you rate yourself on indicators like distraction, goals, hard work, focus, finishing projects, which I decided does not have to do with knitting projects. It also, you self-rate yourself on consistency, diligence, and how you handle setbacks. Although I don't view myself as a John Wayne character with grit in my teeth, I scored high on the grit scale test. Why? Well, some of it may be personality. Maybe the test is rigged. But much of it, I guess, would be culture. The culture I grew up in, my family, school, society, expected and rewarded these grit skills. The advantages I had due to my social location of class, race, education, etc., also supported and made possible these grit skills. Duckworth claims that grit predicts achievement in ways that neither IQ nor talent can. Grit is a non-cognitive skill that can be developed in children to help them succeed against all odds. Grit has been taking public education by storm. Some schools even use a grittiness report card. But there is also critique that teaching grit and trying to measure grit in students downplays structural barriers to their success, like racism and economic injustice that many children face. An article from Business Insider last April illuminates this from a personal point of view. If anyone should embody grit, it's 30-year-old Haben Girma, who is black, blind, and deaf, but graduated from Harvard Law School in 2013, and within 3 years found herself on Forbes' 30 Under 30 list. But the lawyer, whose parents are African American immigrants, doesn't like how the word grit puts the burden on the individual to toughen up and work through challenges. She said, all my successes have been because people around me, such as my employers, have been very inclusive. Girma went on to work as an attorney for U.S. nonprofit disability rights advocates, where she won a landmark lawsuit against the popular online library Scribd to make their documents accessible to blind people. Along the way, she collected a slew of awards and honors, including the Alexandrine Medal. Today, she does public speaking to raise awareness about making products and services accessible to the disabled. Yet Girma insists none of this is grit. She does not like the narrative of a disabled person successfully overcoming disability. Society needs to change, she insists. It needs to remove the barriers it created that make it difficult for people to succeed. Girma has learned how to surf and also dances salsa, kayaks, and goes rock climbing and skiing. But grit, she says, isn't what helped her do those things. Instead, she said, it was coming up with alternative solutions. What about the role of grief in resilience? Adversity of any kind brings change and loss. Jane Brody wrote in her personal health column in the New York Times just a few weeks ago, "When life throws you curveballs, embrace the new normal." She lifted up examples of people with cancer. Linda Walters has a cancer that is currently incurable, she wrote, diagnosed just after her 49th birthday. As an Idaho farm girl used to hard work, Walters led a healthy life, enjoying ballroom dancing, horseback riding, rafting, and hiking when not at work at a law firm. Then, as she wrote in her recently published book, Voices of Cancer, everything changes with cancer. Everything. Life will never be the same again, even on the smallest of levels. Something will be forever different. There is no going back to who you once were. So, embrace it and grow with it and from it. When people say, when you start looking a little better, when people say, now that you're back to normal, it's like a knife to the heart. We cannot compare our current state to where we were prior to diagnosis. Yet, having a new normal is not always bad. Brody also interviewed Dr. Wendy Harpham in 2003 when her first book, Diagnosis Cancer, was published. Dr. Harpham was 36 years old, a mother of 3 very young children, with a private practice in internal medicine, a career which she loved, when she learned she had a life-threatening lymphoma with no established cure. The illness forced her to close her practice, then prompted her to start a second career, writing books to help people and their loved ones cope with cancer as best as their disease allowed. She said, "When my cancer came back and my prognosis worsened, I chose to deal with the uncertainty by doing the best I could today, each day, living as fully as possible within the limits of my survival. I had to accept my new limits. But first, I had to grieve what I lost before I could move on and embrace what remained. And here's where I think the difference between grit and resilience lies. Grit is the determination to survive and reach your goals, whereas resilience requires the ability to grieve. We can't heal from experiences of diversity. That was a funny typo. We can't heal from experiences of adversity. Unless we allow ourselves to grieve. You may be familiar with Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant's book, Option B, Facing Adversity, Building Resilience, and Finding Joy, written after the sudden and unexpected death of Sandberg's husband in 2015. Sandberg, COO at Facebook, wrote, "Resilience is the strength and speed of our response to adversity, and we can build it. It isn't about having a backbone. It's about strengthening the muscles around our backbone." Their book is an inspiring journey through loss and grief. It's like having a personal trainer at your side. They break things down so you can understand what's happening, and then they help you exercise underused muscles to cope. They write, "After spending decades studying how people deal with setbacks, positive psychologist Martin Seligman found that 3 P's can stunt recovery. Number 1, personalization, the belief that we are at fault. Number 2, pervasiveness, the belief that an event will affect all areas of our life. And number 3, permanence, the belief that the aftershocks of the event will last forever. Hundreds of studies have shown that children and adults recover more quickly when they realize that hardships aren't entirely their own fault, don't affect every aspect of their lives, and won't follow them everywhere forever. If these 3 Ps are addressed by the griever and their support system, the less likely they are to get depressed, and the better they are equipped to cope. Earlier, we talked about the dictionary definition of resilience as bouncing back into a previous shape. Sandberg and Grant's book suggest people can also bounce forward. A student of Grant's discovered this after his son died. As a physician, Joe Casper devoted most of his career to treating patients with life-threatening illnesses. Still, when his teenage son, Ryan, was diagnosed with a rare and fatal form of epilepsy, he felt completely at a loss. He said, "In a few short moments, I learned my son's fate, and there was nothing I could do about it. No hope for a cure." His son Ryan died 3 years after the diagnosis, thrusting Joe into what he describes as the emotional tsunami of his son's death. He said, "If there is anything more painful in life, I hope never to discover it." For Joe, the breakthrough in his grieving occurred when he realized that his actions could be part of his son's legacy. While studying for his master's degree in positive psychology, Joe created a therapeutic process called co-destiny, which encourages bereaved parents to view their child's life in a larger framework so that death does not become the end of the story. Parents who seek purpose and meaning from their tragedies can go on to do good, which then becomes part of their child's impact on the world. As Joe explained, I realized that my destiny was to live my life in a way that would make my son proud. The awareness that I could add goodness to my son's life by doing good in his name motivates me to this very day. I hope you don't hear in this story that all you have to do to recover from the traumatic loss of a child is to figure out how you can contribute to their legacy. Grieving, especially the loss of a child, is much more complicated than that. You have to journey through your own unique grieving process to reach your own conclusions. John James and Russell Friedman wrote in their book, Grief Recovery Handbook, that we've all been taught very unhelpful things about grief because our culture is grief averse. Here's what they say we're all taught about how to handle grief. Don't feel bad. Replace the loss. Grieve alone. Just give it time. Be strong for others, and keep busy. In essence, we've been taught to show grit in the face of loss. But grit, although it has its uses, grit doesn't heal suffering. Grieving does. A therapist named Candace Ossifert Russell wrote a compassionate critique of the book Option B in an article called Resilience, a New Grief Myth That Can Hurt You. She wrote, I'm worried that the 21st century bandwagon of resilience is becoming a new hurtful grief myth that grievers will have to fight against in order to heal. A myth that will make grievers feel ashamed if they cannot quickly bounce back, if they cannot return to a self they once were, if they cannot strive toward joy when actually they are slogging through. Yet in truth, grievers who cannot accomplish these feats are normal. When I was suddenly widowed at the age of 30, she continues, and my son was an 11-month-old nursing infant, the only reason I got out of bed in the morning was to keep my son alive and to try to make some semblance of a normal life for him. So on the surface, building resilience, she said, to make it through the tough times seems like a good idea. But there's a shadow side to it. Throughout their book, Sandberg and Grant use terms like overcome adversity, triumph over sadness, recover from grief, regain control, find joy. Even though this perspective has helped Ms. Sandberg bear the unbearable, these terms set my teeth on edge. Why? Because I find every one of them subtly disempowering. Loss is an injury to the psyche, to the soul. Though painful, grief is actually the brain, body, soul's natural, healthy, and necessary response to this universal wound. She ends by saying, to try to bounce back to our old ways of being is to refuse to accept that there is no going back, much as we'd like to. So what is my conclusion from this exploration of grit, grief, and resilience. Like any concept, it's not the word so much as how we use it. Grit may be necessary to survive, to accomplish goals, to get through adversity. Grief happens whether we want it to or not. And resilience? We become more resilient people when we help each other through adversity. Perhaps this poem says it best. Heavy by Mary Oliver. That time I thought I could not go any closer to grief without dying. I went closer, and I did not die. Surely God had his hand in this as well as friends. Still, I was bent, and my laughter, as the poet said, was nowhere to be found. Then said my friend Daniel, brave even among lions, it's not the weight you carry, but how you carry it. Books, bricks, grief, it's all in the way you embrace it, balance it, carry it, when you cannot and would not put it down. So I went practicing. Have you noticed? Have you heard the laughter that comes now and again out my startled mouth? How I linger to admire, admire the things of this world that are kind and maybe also troubled. Roses in the wind, the sea geese on the steep waves, a love to which there is no reply.